on this episode of Live Here. Panhandle PBS gains exclusive access to a Texas Forensic Associates workshop at the Amarillo Police Department gun range. Go behind the scenes as officers learn how to follow the bullets at a crime scene. All of this right now on Panhandle PBS, where we enlighten, educate, entertain, and inform you of how we live here.
You know, this case, like many cases, starts rather at a low level, and you wouldn't expect it to escalate to this. It was a neighborhood dispute. It must have boiled over for him. And on a particular night, he went down to the neighbor's house, well armed, attacked the home and attacked the neighbors, killing the mother and father and wounding the son.
The voice you just heard is that of Rudy Flores, retired Texas Ranger. Flores is one of 2 investigators who recently led a week of crime scene reconstruction training at the Amarillo Police Department gun range west of the city. Panhandle PBS was there as law enforcement officers learned how to collect and record evidence and to follow bullets to suspects. The process is painstaking enough when 1 or 2 shots have been fired. But in the rural Texas neighborhood dispute Flores just began to describe, the crime scene was far more complex.
We had a rifle and a pistol involved. The rifle fired 86 rounds prior to the entry into the house by the shooter.
The Houston County home strafed by bullets appeared in photographs on a classroom screen as Flores walked trainees through the murders of residents Annette and Nathan Copeland. Their teenage son also was wounded in the attack at Lovelady, roughly 100 miles north of Houston. Dozens of bullet marks, called defects, would have to be located, cataloged by a numbered code, and photographed as evidence was collected.
So we're going to have 86 fired cartridge cases, 86 entries into the house from the exterior to the interior. Now, a lot of times bullets will fragment, the jacket will peel off of the bullet, so that can have, as it flies through the wall and comes out the other side, it can create 2 more defects. If it doesn't strike something immediately, can fly through the house, strike other objects, and create more defects and more evidence. So, and that's one of the cases in a course like this where we're doing the investigation and reconstruction of shooting incidents. We like to illustrate how expansive these cases can get and how detailed and how complicated they become very, very quickly. It doesn't take very long to shoot 86 rounds from a semi-auto rifle, but it's going to take hours and hours to process that crime scene effectively, document everything, and recover all that evidence.
Flores explained several approaches to creating evidence reference codes. The numbering and lettering systems for evidence would be crucial for determining what occurred when Barney Fuller Jr. approached the house in the early hours of May 14, 2003.
It's the backbone of the investigation. We have to do it correctly. We only get one chance to do it right the first time. There's really no going back and redoing it after the fact. So,
most students participating in the class work in law enforcement in the Amarillo area, but some drove from as far away as Midland and Brownsville to take the course, which combined classroom work with live fire exercises. Texas Forensic Associates can only offer the training from ranges like Amarillo's that have outdoor space where glass can be shattered, metal fractured, and wood splintered.
In the practicals that we just created, one of the defects was created at 90 degrees relative to the surface. Well, at 90 degrees, that forms a circular defect. So if that was perfectly 90 degrees, not only vertical, but also horizontal, then the points of possibility for our shooter would be, if we were dealing with that scene, anywhere from there until it was physically impossible for that particular bullet to have traveled any further, because we're on a flat trajectory. However, at 70 degrees relative to that surface, it begins coming out away from there, and it forms an elliptical defect in the target surface itself. And as it begins coming out away from there, we're going to encounter impediments which would make it impossible for someone to have fired beyond that point.
With the scene set, students emerge from the classroom armed with information from lectures to tackle assignments.
Scissors, magnifying glass, tape measure, caliper.
With shooting incidents, the closer we can narrow down where a shooter was and actually resolve the truth as to what happened in the shooting incident, the better off we are.
Oh, sorry. What the students behind me are using right now is they're using portions of this trajectory kit or shooting incident reconstruction kit. In particular, right now, you'll see them using these flight path rods that are they're in segments. You can join them together, and then you can use those to trace the flight path through an object like a drywall or a vehicle. You'll see that there's also this little plastic device here called a centering cone, so that they're more accurate in their depiction with the flight path rod of the true pathway of the bullet. Without the flight path rod, without the centering cone, the rod would just sit loosely on the bottom edge of the defect, and that's not going to be a true pathway because the bullet passed through the center of the defect, not the bottom edge only. And that allows us to be more accurate. If we don't have the cone set to center it, we might be 2 or 3 degrees off, and at a short distance, that's not that significant, but shooting scenes often cover long distances, so being 2 or 3 degrees off, 100 yards down the range would be a very significant variation and not give us a true flight pathway or trajectory. They're also using these protractors, and they're called zero-base protractors, so that when they string the flight path, that they're truly at a zero base to the target surface that it occurred on. Your standard protractor that you buy from an office supply store, graphic supply store, the zero will be slightly raised above the base. Most of them include a ruler on the bottom. And if you run your strings off of that, automatically you have an error because you're too high above the surface when you start, so you have to use a zero base. They're also out there, they're using, of course, they'll add the string to the flight path rods. The string will be held in place by a little eyelet, a little jig that you'll tie the string off to in line with the flight path rods, and then you can either use that and string it back at a known angle towards the suspected origin of the bullet, or if you're going the other way, you can string it to a terminus where the terminal location of the bullet occurred. You can do that with the flight path rods and strings, or if you're covering greater distances, it's often a lot easier for the students to be able to use an inline laser, which will screw in line with the flight path rods and project the laser beam back towards the origin of the shooter or the bullet, or towards the terminus if we put it on the other side. And there are photographic techniques that we teach them using fog or other items to make that laser visible, because normally we only see the dot from the laser where it hits a target, but there's a solid beam between the origin of the laser and the dot. And by using, a fog like this, we can make that fog make the laser beam visible, and we can photograph that for documentation purposes and presentation purposes. Not every bullet that's fired is going to produce a nice bullet defect like this. Occasionally we have ricochets or creases. They just barely nick a scene or something. And we'll have kits like this that allow us to look at a mark that's at a crime scene and then use the chemicals here to either test for the presence of lead or copper to see if it has any if that mark has any forensic significance within the confines of that crime scene. Okay? Now this kit would allow you to detect and better visualize atomized lead residue. So we fire a gun, and it's got lead in the bullet. Little pieces of lead accumulate in the barrel. The next round that's fired out of that gun, whether it's a revolver or semi-automatic weapon, it's going to push some of that lead debris out of the end of the barrel, and it's going to go in the direction of travel of the bullet, and it's going to disperse. It's not always visible to the naked eye due to its small, minute particles, or the color substrate that it's on. If it's on a dark-colored, dark blue or black or gray target surface, we may not be able to visualize it. But the application of this chemical, it causes, it's a sodium rhodizonate chemical that reacts with lead and turns it kind of a magenta or purplish color. It makes it very visible so we can photograph and document the location of that. Not only does that help us identify it, if we know where the lead was at, we can place where that shooter would have been in order to produce that lead distribution, and that'll help us either confirm or refute information given to us by suspects, victims, and witnesses.
Flores was a Texas Ranger in a district that included Palestine, where Webb retired as a police lieutenant. Their work together on homicides led them to begin training others in crime scene investigation techniques.
So in many cases, what we use shooting reconstruction for is to attempt to prove someone's story true. When we get a story from a victim or a suspect or a witness, we tend to use the shooting reconstruction, or any crime scene reconstruction for that matter, to attempt to prove what they said is true. And it's only when we're unable to prove that truth, or when the evidence that we find actually refutes what they say, that there's a problem.
Webb says there's no limit to cases in which shooting reconstruction played a significant role in helping to gain a conviction.
Well, I can give you several case examples. But I'll tell you, the most important one to me was one where shooting reconstruction didn't play a part, and it should have. One of the first homicides that I worked was, probably around 1996. A young man claimed that he and his dad had been out shooting, and he was letting the hammer down on his pistol. After they got back home, his dad was asleep in the chair, and he was letting the hammer down on his pistol, and it slipped out from under his thumb and discharged and shot his dad and caused his death. At that time, I knew that that story didn't sound true, but I couldn't prove that it wasn't. And it was only later, after I learned some basics of shooting reconstruction and bloodstain pattern analysis, that I look back on that case today and realized that had I known then, or had I known of a resource then that knew what I know now, that would not have been the outcome of that case. The suspect in that case actually wound up pleading to probation on a voluntary manslaughter rather than the murder of his father, which is what that should have been.
Flores worked 137 homicides during his career. He calls on another case to explain creation of a visual record, the photographs that convey size, scale, object relationships, and context. In this particular crime, no bullets were involved, but the documentation procedure remains the same, always zooming in from broader context to specific detail.
This is a capital murder case, death penalty case we got involved in. This is the US 79. Neches River. It's the boat dock, the boat ramp on the Cherokee County side. That's Anderson County side. Because remember, I'm not taking these photos from me. I was there. I went out there. I'm not taking them for the other cops that were out there. I'm taking them for the judge or the jury or the grand jurors or the people that have to weigh the facts of the trial. So I'm trying to explain this case to anybody that's going to be sitting in the jury box during the trial. And I say, well, we had a missing person report. We also had a stolen vehicle report, and the missing person and the owner of the stolen vehicle were the same person. They were this elderly 83-year-old retired school teacher and church organist. And we're out actively searching and looking for this. We get a 911 call from a truck driver who was traveling west on US 79 from Cherokee County, and as he crossed the bridge, he saw something in the water that alarmed him. He thought it looked like a body. So we responded to the 911 call. We went out to the boat ramp on the Cherokee County side, and as we got down to the base of the boat ramp and looked into the water, we too saw something that was alarming. So we get more specific. That was very, very general. As we got to the base of the boat ramp, this is actually the aerial photograph was taken after the fact. This was taken on the day. It was cold, it was wet, it was icy, it was overcast. And here's my reference. Remember, I'm building images, I'm building memories. I want them to know where we're at. There's Anderson County over here. Here's Cherokee County. There's the bridge. We walked further down from that specific area to a very specific object. As we got to the base of the boat ramp at the Neches River in Cherokee County, saw an object in the water. The object was clad in a red sweater, multicolor vest, black slacks, one black shoe, bound hand and foot, and duct tape around the face and mouth. We knew from photographs, we knew from our investigation by first view, this was our missing person. Very, very specific object, very, very specific information. Well, photography is the backbone of crime scene documentation. It's the only way for us to present what we saw when we saw it to the folks that are going to make the decisions about these investigations, the jurors or grand jurors or the judge in the case of a bench trial. That's the only way for us to bring them into the crime scene and experience what we saw and see the evidence in the context and the detail that we saw it in. The criminal justice system is slow but sure. It takes a while for things to come to trial sometimes. Then through the legal process, sometimes they're reversed or remanded for another trial, they're postponed, or there's another hearing. By having good documentation, report writing, complete and thorough, it allows us to not have to rely only on our memories for those details in those investigations, but to have it fully documented at the time we were involved in it, the time we were living that case, so that when we come back to it later and have to testify to it, everything we did and everything we know about it is written there for us, and it allows us to refresh our memories, as well as to provide that to the prosecutor or to the court or even to the jurors that are going to be in trial with us. They have access to that report as well.
Much of the training resembled a television crime drama. Flores says those shows are real, to a point.
CSI is based in reality. I kind of like to make the analogy that CSI is about as real as Walker, Texas Ranger. You know, it's based in reality. It's fun to watch, but there's a lot of entertainment in there as well.
More real are the math and science on which investigations rely.
There is math in this. We calculate using some trig functions, angles of impact and stuff. There's some known formulas that we use. These students will be trained on that. Once they know the formulas and they know how to input the data that they collect through their measurements and documentation, it's like using a microwave oven to prepare your dinner. If you follow directions, push the right buttons, at the end it's going to cook your dinner correctly. If you follow our directions, gather the data from the investigation, input the data correctly into the scientific calculator, following the keypad instructions, you're going to get an angle of impact or trajectory that's correct.
You're never good at anything that you only do one time in the classroom. So, what we try to do is we teach them the basics. We teach them the bones of what they need to go practice. And the more they practice, the better they'll get.